Lesson 2, Introduction to the Camera, Basic Mistakes in Photography. So here we are. So you want to learn how to get away with taking respectable pictures without going to an actual photography training school. Let's take it step by step with easy fixes. So if you want to take great photos, you do need to understand some basic theoretical aspects, like exposure. And the exposure triangle is one of them, and of course the foundation of photography. Of course, with the new smartphones, you can get away with these photos by using automatic settings, but then you will not be able to fully represent the image or the story that you wish to take, or the narrative. If you do invest a bit of time to get a grasp of the basics, then you will be able to use the functions and possibilities of your camera or smartphone in a way that it can represent your eye, your vision, your creative idea. So let's kick it off. What is exposure? Exposure in photography is all about light and the process of controlling how much light will eventually hit the digital sensor in your camera. And unlike what they say, artists cannot live on exposure. We also need to get paid work. So 3 main ingredients or elements work together in exposure: aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. They may sound alien at this point, but we are going to break them down one by one. And all these 3 are very essential on the end result that we want to achieve. And they're interconnected. And that's why we place them on the triangle you can see on the right-hand side that is named in a very original way, the exposure triangle, which is described as the foundation for photography. It may sound like Chinese to you now. However, once you understand how this works, you'll be able to take better photos using the various settings on your camera and deliver the result that you initially desired. Okay, let's do it. Aperture definition. So what is aperture? It is basically the opening of the lens through which light passes to the camera and is measured in f-stops or just stops, which usually ranges from f1.2 to f32. How does that translate within the camera? So inside the camera lens, there is a mechanical iris diaphragm that controls the amount of light transmitted to the imaging sensor in the camera. The diaphragm stops the passage of light except for the light that passes through the hole or the aperture. It is a lot like the shades on a window control the light. If we want to take it to another narrative, it's like the diaphragm of our body when we breathe. Changing apertures from one f-stop to the next, up or down, doubles or cuts in half the amount of light passing through the lens. A smaller f-stop number, like f2.8, means a larger opening of the iris. When you change the aperture from f2.8 to f4, it's called stopping down. A wide open aperture results in a shallow depth of field, whereas a narrower aperture results in a deeper depth of field. But there is only one way to explore this: by trial and error, and translating this into an actual image that you can express yourself and decide if you desire depth or shallowness on what you wish to deliver. So what is depth? That was kind of confusing when we addressed it in the previous slide. So the term depth of field is common photography jargon, like the street language of photography. It refers to the part of a photo that is in an acceptable, sharp focus, the part of the photo that is clear to see. So the range of how much is in focus varies depending on the settings you choose and the camera and lens you use. Even if the cameras we're using nowadays are connected to our smartphones, they still follow the same principles. So understanding the connection between aperture and focus and depth will also help you take better photos with whichever tool you choose to pursue your creative journeys. There are, of course, other factors that govern the depth of field. These factors are the size of your camera sensor, the distance from your object, and the focal length of the lens. Of course, we cannot always change the size of our camera, so by adjusting the distance and the focal length of the lens, we can increase or decrease the depth and the focus of the set photo. Shutter speed. How does one measure shutter speed? Shutter speed is measured, like any other speed, in time increments. So these range from full seconds to a fraction of a second. So this can be sometimes 1/8,000. That's pretty fast. The larger the shutter speed, the faster the shutter opens and closes. It exposes less light to the camera sensor. So larger shutter speed denominator equals faster opening and closing of the shutter. Fast equals less light. So when you use a slower shutter speed, the shutter is open longer. Then the image sensor is exposed to more light than when you use a faster shutter speed. How long the shutter speed helps determine the exposure time. The longer your shutter speed is, the brighter your photo will be. You can compensate for using a slow shutter speed by using a narrower aperture or a lower ISO setting. There's not just one way of getting the light, the brightness or the darkness you wish to get in a photo. It's all a combination within the aperture triangle that we referred to a few slides before. ISO setting, we just mentioned it a while ago, but what is it? So the ISO setting is one control on a camera that allows you to control how bright or dark a photo is. Surprise, surprise, same like the shutter speed or the aperture. The other two, as we mentioned before, are aperture and shutter speed. So a high ISO setting means the sensor is more responsive to light. And in contrast, a low ISO setting has the opposite effect. So bright light, it's better to use low ISO setting. So if we are shooting at midday, low ISO setting. Whereas if the light is low, let's say the golden hour around 7 p.m., the high ISO setting would be a much more favorable setting for the desired result. As everything that we adjust in our camera, adjusting the ISO affects the value of our exposure. So increasing the ISO increases the value of exposure. But like everything in this life, it does have its consequences. So every time one shifts from a low ISO value, it creates something called digital noise. Digital noise will show up as tiny spots or bright pixels on your photos. They are more noticeable in darker areas of the image and are less noticeable when you use a low ISO. So there is always a price to pay for the luxuries we get, either in light, life, or death.